Peas and carrots. I shell while he scrubs, peels, and dices. Love a shell we peel, curl inside. Loneliness a shell hulling us from inside. What's boiled found to taste better with butter. The boiling point reached, make-up sex goes buttery. I wash the plates before he starts to clean up. Should we shower apart, we don't feel clean. In pots on the boil, bugs rise to the top. Orange not boiling dry with green on the stove top. Mixed singularities served with every meal. Love and loneliness spooning, our usual meal. So usual, a side dish with heat going soft. Fridge cold, not restoring crunch to softness. I shell while he scrubs, peels, and dices.
Welcome to the Poet Laureate podcast, a luminous sanctuary for poetry and reflection. I'm Kyeren Regehr, and episode 2 is supported by the Malahat Review, a cornerstone of Canadian letters since 1967. Published quarterly by the University of Victoria, the Malahat Review showcases exceptional contemporary literary writing from Canada and beyond. Explore more at malahatreview.ca. We just heard Peas and Carrots by John Barton, who was the 5th Poet Laureate of Victoria, BC. Welcome, John, and thank you for being here. That poem just now arrived in our ears for the first time. Where did it first begin for you?
It's based on a very brief dream I had of two friends making a meal, and they were making vegetables, peas and carrots. And a therapist interpreted the dream for me, which was, each vegetable was distinct, but when they merged, they kind of represented the merged relationship. And so that dream I had way back in the mid-'80s, and I wrote the poem probably the first draft about 5 years ago. And the form is the duplex. And so I just used the devices of the form to tease out the meanings from it. And so when I say mixed singularities, it's really referring back to what the therapist said about the image of peas and carrots.
Amazing. John, you've engaged deeply with formal constraint, not only through traditional structures like the sonnet or cento, but also through uniquely generative practices such as rewriting a poem by someone else, by entirely rearranging that poem's words, which I believe you named remixes. Could you speak to the allure of this kind of formal rigor?
Well, the allure for me has been that form forces me to think outside my comfort zones. As you know, I've written countless sonnets, and to respect the form, I can't just simply write down the line as it kind of comes out spontaneously. I have to adjust it. And in order to make it fit to the rhyme scheme or to the syllable count, to the metrics, it forces me to consider other ways of saying something. And it forces me in a way, or allows me to rethink and go deeper into the subject in a way that I might not have considered if I had simply written a free verse line. And I like that challenge of rethinking and revisiting, and I think it has kind of made me more flexible as a writer. Even though a lot of people think form would be limiting, I think it's quite expansive, simply because it challenges not me technically, but also thematically.
So the constraint opens an imaginative freedom for you, and these literary puzzles, do they perhaps help you make sense of what can't be said plainly?
I think it's the desire to go deeper, and it's an incentive. It's not that you can't go deeper, obviously, in any form or any approach, but it just, for me, it's a deeper engagement with the language. And that leads me to look at what I'm saying from more angles. I guess the simplest way of describing it's like synonyms. You could say something is bright, but it also could be luminous, and the two words have such a different feel to them. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what form does for me.
It allows you to view way more options and then select from those, yes.
Right. And the options cause me to think about what I'm saying. And so it helps me make it more accurate and also provide surprise. Oh, it's interesting to see it this way. And how do I make it all work in concert with everything else, just like with any other form of writing. But
so then, with that being said, do you think that form takes you to a different ending that you may have initially envisioned?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think necessarily. The other things. I mean, obviously, I didn't begin as a formalist. I don't even think of myself as a formalist particularly. Mm-hmm. And all the other things that I do in my writing, like single sentence poems and things like that, I still do within that form. It just adds a degree of difficulty. Mm-hmm. I guess that's what I like. Is I like the challenge that I set up, and I guess to me what you want is something that sounds natural. So to take all those devices and make it sound natural, I think is the measure of its success.
How to turn a literary Sudoku into art.
Right. Or something that people will hear. They may, on a visceral level, enjoy all of the auditory richness within the literary form I've chosen, but it doesn't in itself become a barrier, either through the awkwardness of the language because I haven't or succeeded in making it fit the line properly. But, so it's almost like a form of stealth.
Oh, I love that. John, you have published over 20 books of poetry and essays, as well as now hundreds of sonnets. Might we see your work as a kind of long poem of your life, one that unfolds across decades? And how do earlier selves remain or vanish in later collections?
Well, I guess a really good example is my book on Emily Carr. I wrote that book when I was between the ages of 21 and 27. Feels very long ago. And yet it's a book that has remained current in some ways. It's gone through 3 editions.
Wow.
But how do I embrace it as a queer poet? And so I've often described Emily Carr as my drag identity. In fact, an academic wrote a paper analyzing the book from that point of view.
Oh, I love that.
But the other one is, of course, I came out in my work. And so I felt a little awkward about that. There are 2 books that kind of that emerged together, were published 3 years apart. Great Men, which is a queer work, and then Notes Toward a Family Tree, which I say is my fond farewell to heterosexuality. And I felt awkward that it came out second. And so I felt awkward enough, I felt a need to write an afterword, kind of contextualizing that. I don't know if I would feel that awkwardness now, but I did back in 1993.
Right.
And in fact, my original plan with those 2 books was it would be a single book called Comedians in the Same Desire.
Oh, such a good title.
But somebody suggested that because I had a lot of poems, this has always been an issue with me, that I divide them. And so I did. But, and again, I think that the terms like gender fluid, no one was using those terms at all back then. Even the idea of, we look at the acronym for LGBTQ, we keep adding a letter or a punctuation mark or a mathematical symbol to embrace the multiplicity of being queer. Back then, it took a while to add the B after LG,
Wow.
Yeah. So even that idea of being that various within was kind of, even within the queer community, not exactly understood. People thought being bisexual was sitting on the fence.
Right.
So, anyway, so that was all in the background. I suppose.
2 books.
Yeah, maybe not consciously, but thinking back, I can imagine that those were things that were making me concerned. And it's funny, when I think about my selected poems, the book that's least represented in that book is Notes Toward a Family Tree.
Right.
So, I suppose we shed identities, but we can't shed our past.
Well said. Your forthcoming collection, Compulsory Figures, moves between personal memory and queer lineage and larger histories of place and inheritance. It feels like a reckoning with presence and absence, like how those we've lost or never met still leave deep impressions on us. What did you discover about influence and its distance and its intimacy while writing these poems?
So the book kind of has its origins in a series of family deaths. The title poem, Compulsory Figure, as opposed to the title of the book, Compulsory Figures, is a poem about my sister who died now 10 years ago. And so I guess if I were to describe the impact of her death was I didn't realize how close I was to her until after she was gone, because you, especially with a sibling, you just grow up in proximity, and you don't question it or analyze it, I guess, unless there's some kind of problematic quality to it. And so it was the gateway into the whole collection. And I dealt with my mother's death. My mother died, 7 months before my sister. Very different kind of death. And then I just started exploring aspects of the family, my parents' divorce. And so I guess these are things that I don't think haunting is the right word, but they leave a shadow and they shape you. And I like to think of compulsory figures as not just about people, but the patterns. And then the book kind of evolved into exploring sort of the ideas of family and patriarchy and culture and patriarchy and settler colonialism. And it ends with this, a sequence of poems about queerness and, in a way, queer community, queer mentorship. There are many poems about writers who've been important to me. The first time I was kind of conscious of a queer literature was with Christopher Isherwood, who wrote the novels that are the basis of the movie Cabaret. And I remember going to Cabaret when I was 16 with my parents and feeling a kinship. I have to remember back then there were very few images of queer life for you to use to figure yourself out. And I just knew that there was something there. I always remember the last scene where Liza Minnelli as Sally Bowles is walking away from Michael York after she's puts him on the train and he's going back to England. And she just, raises her hand walking away, and you see her emerald green fingernails wiggling goodbye. And that changed my life.
Wow. And
so that, there's a poem about my experience of that, of Isherwood, and friendship. So, the book is kind of built around the idea of influence. So it's family influence, cultural influence, historical influence, and literary influence.
Well, speaking of influence, your work as an editor at the Malahat Review, Arc Poetry Magazine, in anthologies, as a mentor, you've shaped Canadian poetry profoundly. How has your editorial life influenced your own writing, and has it changed what you ask of a poem?
I think what it's shown me is what you need to do to make the poem accessible to the reader. And I always kind of think the first measure of a poem's success is if the reader gets to the end of it. Certainly as an editor, reading thousands of poems over a year that have been submitted, if I got to the end, something must be working.
Right.
And so how do you keep the reader with you is something that I may not think about consciously, but I'm always thinking about how to carry forward. And I think also what keeps a reader going is just like as if you were reading a mystery, you want to know what happens. What's going to be the end result. And you both want to satisfy them, like, oh yeah, I thought you were going to get there, but also surprise them too in some way. I didn't expect you to get there that way.
Right.
So I think it's the process of reading others influences the way you decide you wish to be read or hope to be read.
So gorgeously said. Thank you, John. I'm wondering if you would please read us another poem. And also, all the listeners should know that after this poem, there'll be a brief guitar interlude so that they can rest and reflect on your words.
I'm going to read a remix, which, as you described, is I take a poem by another poet and, without removing or changing or adding to their words, rearrange them into a poem of my own. And it's something that I've been doing a while. The title poem of my book, Polari, is a remix of a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks called Gay Chaps at the Bar. And then in the doldrums of the pandemic, I decided to remix a poem by a friend of mine, and 34 remixes later,
wow.
I'm, trying to figure out what to do with them. So I remixed a poem by Frank O'Hara, who a poet of the 50s and the 60s, subversively queer poet based in New York. And this is a poem from his collection, Meditations in an Emergency. And so I'm going to read his poem, which is called For Grace After a Party. You do not always know what I'm feeling. Last night, in the warm spring air, while I was blazing my tirade against someone who doesn't interest me, it was love for you that set me afire. And isn't it odd? For in rooms full of strangers, my most tender feelings writhe and bear the fruits of screaming. Put out your hand. Isn't there an ashtray suddenly there, beside the bed? And someone you love enters the room and says, wouldn't you like the eggs a little different today? And when they arrive, they are just plain scrambled eggs, and the warm weather is holding. And my poem is called In Eggs and Love, with apologies to Frank O'Hara. Who enters rooms while screaming a tirade, someone says, set against the grace of tender strangers, feeling put out when the ashtray isn't full and the party afire. After, you holding my hand there for the weather, the last of the spring, an odd blazing. That room was warm. You beside me in bed, and wouldn't you know your love is different? Isn't it always for someone? Do most feelings arrive suddenly? Are they scrambled, warm, and right there? For they just writhe. A little air doesn't interest me today. I like fruit and my eggs plain, am not what I was, and you bear it.
Wow, thank you for that poem, John, and for offering poems that give voice to the queer community during Pride Month. I'm grateful for that. So that poem was made entirely from the words of Frank O'Hara's poem.
Yes.
And this is your form, remixes.
What kind of inspired it? Many years ago, a friend of mine, the novelist and poet Helen Humphreys, just mentioned to me casually that she'd taken a poem by Elizabeth Bishop and rearranged it. And I recently reread that poem and also what she says about it in the notes to the book in which it appears. And she didn't do it as slavishly as I have attempted to do. I think she changed the words and a little bit and added and subtracted. I want to ask her about that. But that was tucked away in my brain for about 20 years before I decided to do it myself. Back in 2011 is when I probably remixed the Gwendolyn Brooks poem. And I've kind of evolved in my approach to, in the 4 or 5 years I've been doing this, where I now even limit myself to the punctuation that what I call the donor poem uses. So I'll use the same number of commas, and with the Frank O'Hara poem I didn't do that, but now I just keep track of everything and only use what's there on the page.
That's rigorous.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of the challenge, and to make it sound natural. Like even this one, I changed something last night.
You did?
I did. And it's appeared. It was published in the Ampersand Review earlier this year, and I don't know, just reading it, I saw a fresh way of doing it, and so I guess I'm just some people would say I'm a worrier of the line, but I let the words keep speaking, and I've gotten better at it. I think at the remixing, as I've mastered the approach. I just, as it was the sonnet, it was just probably initially just glad I got it down. Now I'm initially glad I managed to use all those words and didn't leave any out, didn't add anything. Now I'm just a little bit more demanding of myself.
Right. It's quite amazing. It's quite a feat. As I really wanted to ask you about Kirby and how in a review of We Are Not Avatars, he referred to you as a gay Canlit icon. You could be a gay Canlit literary Sudoku icon. But what does it mean, John, to have occupied that space across your career? Do you feel the landscape of the queer community, queer poetry community in Canada has shifted during your career, and how has your own voice evolved within it?
Well, that's a big question.
It is.
I think that, the first time I wrote anything that was openly queer was 1979. And it was because I was so haunted by knowing this about myself, knowing that I was a queer person. And you can imagine, even though homosexuality, for lack of a better word, was decriminalized in Canada a decade before. None of the protections were really there. It wasn't in the Human Rights Acts of any of the provinces, if they had Human Rights Acts back then. And so I kind of wrote out of a pure place of loneliness at the beginning. And then when I started publishing the poems, I had no real sense of anyone else doing it. Now I would, of course, now you can't say that. There is a large community of queer writers in this country. But that was not always the case. Bill A. Nickerson and I co-edited an anthology called Seminal, the Anthology of Canada's Gay Male Poets. And there's 57 people in that anthology. Came out in 2007. And it's kind of, I don't say this out of any sense of arrogance, but the poems where I'm represented in that book, or like that, my first really openly gay book came out in 1990, and that seems to be the fulcrum year.
Wow.
There seems to be way more, like half of the anthology would have, the contents of which would have been published after that date, in comparison to the 90 years prior, because the earliest poet was that we chose published in the 1890s.
Wow.
So even 100 years. And, I kind of keep a, not probably very exhaustive list of all the queer writers who've come forward, who've started publishing since. And, I suspect if we did an update, we'd easily publish another 50. And it's also much more diverse just because of this shift in our sense of voice, of who has the right to speak or who should be allowed to speak. I remember when Bella and I were working on it, we really wanted to have Indigenous poets and BIPOC poets, but they were not easy to find.
Yes.
They didn't. And we did reach out to people for recommendations, but now that wouldn't be the issue at all. I think the issue today would be, should there be an anthology of just gay male poets? Should it be divided that way? The anthology is published by Arsenal Pulp, and just after it came out, I approached them with another person about doing an anthology to celebrate a reading series in Ottawa called Wild About Sappho, which would hold these, galas every year, and we would invite queer writers. Well, I wasn't involved, but in the organization of the reading series, I named it. But we would invite, writers from all over North America to read, and they would be, lesbian, gay male, trans writers. And Arsenal felt that a mixed anthology wouldn't sell, that they were they had more success in selling gay male books to gay male readers and lesbian books to lesbian readers. And I suspect they don't feel that way anymore.
Right.
But
I'm sure that's true.
Yeah, so I would say that's a big change.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big disappointments for me is the support that's provided for queer writing. There's, I think, there's an assumption socially that the literary community embraces as well, that everything is fine for queer people, that they don't need the support. And I think, to me, one of the biggest barriers is the Canada Council itself. They do not provide specialized support for LGBTQ writing at all.
But they used to.
They did not.
They did not.
Never did. Ever. When they rejigged their funding model, they ludicrously said, "Oh, we're now in compliance with the Canadian Equity Act," which was enunciated sometime in the mid '80s, before most of the protections were in place for LGBTQ people. And so the four categories were indigenous writers, visible minorities, that was the term they used for racialized, women, and deaf and disabled. And they, of course, they didn't add queer back then because they didn't think about it.
No,
and I thought how intellectually bankrupt of the Canada Council to merely say they're in compliance with an act that should be updated. And they dropped women from as one of their areas of concern. So, there's a lot of support that's come. I think that there's still problems.
Yeah, most definitely. John, thank you for being so candid and for your fearlessness with what you've just said. It's important. And I want to thank you so much for your presence and your words today. I'd also like to thank the Malahat Review for supporting this episode of the Poet Laureate podcast. The Malahat Review has been a vital space for literary excellence and discovery for nearly 6 decades. As a past contributor and poetry board member, I'm especially proud to celebrate the voices that they continue to discover and uplift. You can support this iconic Canadian literary journal by subscribing at malahatreview.ca. And John Barton's impressive literary biography can be found on the podcast website and also in the notes. John, would you be willing to leave us with a final poem?
With pleasure.
Thank you.
I'm going to read the last poem from Compulsory Figures, and it is an account of being in San Francisco at Pride, the year that the U.S. Supreme Court upheld gay marriage. From a rise overlooking the bay, the men's chorus sings as one in Grace Cathedral at the crown of Nob Hill, one page in the log of HIV dead turned per day in an alcove, leaves illumined by time's troubled proprietary gaze, incense and shadow, candles put to the match, organ stentorian, rose window a burst of wonderment at how little you have altered in the years since my prime. Our brief union an aside handwritten behind the impress of constant strangers in my arms, half grasped in estranged camaraderie, a skeleton key of whistle stops through the Castro, thinning men fragmented into isolates as incongruent as zones of the continent, borders artificial, landmass one of ravishment, men with names I am not equal to, can't think to forget, dyslexic register of where I've traveled, jumbled toward the present, a churn of wake opaque behind the ferry, enticing us across the bay from Sausalito, our absolute amicability, an anchor with less drag than the allure docking has, Alcatraz iconic and inescapable, held without trial in the morning haze, late June feeds off of, sun resistant to longing, entangled in harbored currents, commuters commuted to tourists, the Pride Parade 8 hours long and not even the product branded length of Market Street. No one with stamina ready and on infinite asphalt to give witness start to finish. The ecstatic plaintiffs for marriage in a convertible inching past. Love, stop and go, slow and fast.